I get to welcome many more friends. Welcome, welcome. We invite you to continue eating. If you're eating, you can take your masks off. If you're not eating, we ask you to put your masks on. Our speakers will have their masks off, but I have them far away from you in this big, huge room. We are going to start the program in about 6 minutes, just to give you a warning in case you need to go take a break. And go out, because I know you don't want to miss any part of the conversation with Father Gerry Bowen or with Hazzan Stephanie Weishaar, Cantor Stephanie Weishaar. I'm looking forward to it very much as well. And thank you all for coming out. And thank you. Last week we had a lot of people streaming. We had a large number of people streaming. So I know there are people out there, so thank you for watching as well. So, my friends, this is the last you're going to hear from me up until the very end. Once again, welcome. It is wonderful to have all of us here in this room learning together and all of those online learning together. Some people were surprised that we record this and we stream it. It is streaming on the OMI stream spot, also on the Beta Viv stream spot. And if you will hold on till tomorrow, it will be on the Beta Viv YouTube channel, which is very easy to find. You just, on YouTube, write Beta Viv, that's the name of my congregation. We upload it. You can watch last week's session, you can watch next week's session, so if you miss one, do not worry. I love that we have two of my partners in crime, actually, and that crime is the crime of religion. We have Hazzan Stephanie Weishaar. Hazzan means cantor from Kol Nefesh, which is a congregation that works very closely with Beta Viv. And we have my friend, Father Gerry Bowen from St. John the Evangelist. And they are going to spend 10 minutes each talking about the tiny, tiny topic of life after death. And then it's going to be open to your questions. If you have a question, there is a microphone here in the middle so that you can come up and you can get in line to ask your questions.
You want to go first?
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, I really need help when we get to the 10-minute mark. That's right. It's a wonderful thing to be able to be doing this. I'm very excited about it. Just a little about me. I've been a Catholic pastor at St. John's for 11 years. I've been a priest for 45, always in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. I was a pastor at St. Augustine's Church in Howard County for 17 years. So I'm very happy to be here, and especially with the interfaith, not just a concept, but the ability for us to share the presence of the divine in one another and in the work that we do, and I'm just so grateful for that. I have to start with a joke because we're talking about life after death, and so it says, my young brother asked me what happens after we die. I told him we get buried under a bunch of dirt and worms eat our bodies. I guess I should have told him the truth, that most of us go to hell and burn eternally, but I didn't want to upset him. So, in terms of what is life after death, well, since I grew up in the 1950s, a lot has changed in the Catholic Church's exposition of what is life after death. And we see that in the liturgy very, very differently. For instance, if I read to you from one of the rituals here, which this book belonged to my great uncle, who was a priest, my father's mother's brother. It has in it very figurative language. If we get very poetic, similar to may the choir of virgins welcome you, may the white-robed martyrs come and see you, may the prophets, our elders, embrace you. And so we get some time, I can read just a little section from that. But it was very, very, very glorious, very wonderful. But at the same time, it also had to do with sinfulness, because there was also the other prayers that happened at a funeral, which was the priest wore black. You had orange candles around the casket, and they sang or said the Dies Irae, which is day of wrath, O day of mourning, now has judgment come a-borning. Who for me be interceding when the just are mercy needing? Spare, O Lord, your servant spare. And so pretty much the idea was we all were deserving to go to hell, but by God's grace, we might be able to get into heaven. And so there came into, and a lot of this has been developed over the centuries, and it would be a very interesting class to actually have in, how have we moved to an understanding of what happens when you die. In the Council of Nicaea in 325, we now have the profession of faith that we say at every Mass. And we end with, I confess one baptism for the forgiveness of sins, and I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. That's the last thing we say before we go into, the preparation of the gifts. Blessed are you, Lord God, King of all creation. Through your goodness, we have this bread to offer. So I'm borrowing from Father Harrison because he says it's a 2-minute read, so that'll help keep me on track. He says, the creed concludes with what we hope but have not yet achieved, eternal life. While resurrection speaks of only one thing, the dead coming to new life, of the body becoming incorruptible, reference to the world speaks to the new creation. The creed ends this way because, to an extent, we can say that heaven is not the goal. Heaven, no, in terms of us, you want to make sure you get into heaven. Heaven, when it comes to completion, is the goal. It will be a unity of heaven and earth. And so the resurrection of the body means that we will be reunited to our bodies when, as we believe, Christ comes again. Just as Christ is risen in a body that now no longer suffers or is corruptible, so too we will also share in his glory with our own bodies. St. Paul makes this clear for the Christian side of our faith when he says, when the mortal body puts on immortality, when the corruptible incorruptibility, then will the saying of death be fulfilled. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? So this idea of the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come is a strong affirmation that our bodies are not only good, but they are also gifts to us from God out of love for us. And our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit. The new world that God brings is the heavenly Jerusalem. Peace reigns. It's a time when the lion lays down with the lamb. Swords are beaten into plowshares. A time of the triumph of God's love over sin and death, where God definitively brings about his final plan for all of creation. God will not let what he has created go to waste or be destroyed. Our God is a God of life, and at the end of time, he will lift up all creation back into relationship with him, where all creation will enter into real communion. And so, I then have to say, here's the three divisions that the Catholic Church that we have with regard to, the afterlife. You have heaven, hell, and purgatory. Purgatory is an in-between. Purgatory is where you go when you're not quite ready to go to heaven, but you don't deserve to go to hell. And so it's a place of purification. In the Middle Ages, it was very graphic. If you go to the Sistine Chapel and you see the judgment, and by the way, there's a general judgment and a particular judgment. The particular judgment is when you die, you get to sign whether you're going up or down. That's a particular judgment. The general judgment has to wait until the end of time, where you have this completion of everything being brought to perfection and unity. And that's so you can see all of the effects of what you have done for good and ill over the lifetime of all the generations that ever will come to be, in the world. So now, with regard to purgatory only really came about in like the 12th century or 13th century. We don't need to get into so much of that as to how it developed. But the image of course, was it was like hell, all flames and suffering. And the idea was flames were purifying. You're burning away, your sins. That's nearly not right, but you were suffering for your sins. And what happened, though, is if you look at Dante, he conceives of purgatory as a place of purification, but not because of suffering. It's a place of purification based upon reflection on what we have done. Let me just read this part to you because it's really clear. And C.S. Lewis, in a marvelous little book, The Great Divorce, has the same idea that there is a place of purification and reflection. Let me say this with C.S. Lewis. How am I doing time-wise? 4 minutes? 3 minutes, okay. What C.S. Lewis has in that beautiful small little book, it begins that he does not believe in the idea of eternal damnation being a fate. Rather, he describes it as the sum of a total of error and rejection of God's mercy and goodness. It's an accumulation until you get to the point where God is no longer a part of your life, that God's no longer a part of your life. He's not part of your decision-making day to day. So, essentially what C.S. Lewis does in The Great Divorce is he says people can get on the bus to go to heaven, but they have to be able to acknowledge what their sinfulness is and make the choice to go to heaven. The place that is not identified as hell is a town where quarrels are constant and wants are non-existent, despite there being no drive for industry or economic cooperation among the town's inhabitants. The people of the town live in solitude, constantly driving further and further away from each other and expanding the town's limits to the infinite. The town is an illustration of what hell is like. It's divisive and corrosive, and despite it not possessing fire and brimstone images, academic biblical images, or Catholic iconography throughout history. So here's the problem of heaven and the problem of hell. They need guidance and changing in order to be, the people, the souls, need guidance and changing in order to be able to enter heaven and partake in truly living in the valley of the shadow of life. The afterlife is a choice. Lewis writes in chapter 9, stating there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find, those who knock it's open. Heaven's gifts exist to be chosen, an effort of free will to separate oneself from them fully. And in Dante's Purgatorio, not only is purgatory a place where people willingly suffer to be able to come to grips with the effects of their sins, they're then reflecting on it, and in fact it's a place where they have psalms and prayers, because that's meant to help focus the mind. So heaven, hell, and purgatory. The afterlife, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. I hope this was less confusing than what I think.
Amen. Oh, wow. Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Hazzan Stephanie Weishaar. If you're not familiar with the Jewish tradition of ordination, a cantor is like a rabbi who can sing, is the shortest version I can give you. We study very similar things in seminary and are ordained to do all the life cycle things together or separately. So last week, some of you were here for Rabbi Joseph to explain that Judaism is the religion of strugglers. We struggle with God and struggle with ourselves and struggle with ideas. And my husband was raised Catholic, many of you know that, so we had a joke last night as we were talking about our days coming up. And I said, oh, I'm going to sit with, my buddy Gerry, and this is what we're going to talk about. And he laughed and said, oh, Gerry, he's got it easy. It's hell, purgatory, heaven, done. We know what it is. You may not understand it, you may not like it, but there is an answer. And he said, what the heck are you going to say? Indeed. So one of the interesting things about Judaism is we really don't have a lot of material on what happens after we die, sort of. That's not completely true. I actually have some books that are thick that I can lend you, and if it wasn't time to prepare for our high holidays, I might have skimmed through them and shared some beautiful selections with you. What happened in Judaism is you go back to the very beginning, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, what some call Old Testament. There's not a lot of talk about what happens after we die. All of the talk is in the Talmud, in the oral writings, in the debates between the rabbis centuries ago. And then we had an enlightenment in our society, and most Jews decided that all of that was a little too mystical and a little too wackadoo, and so they weren't buying it. And so the modern Jewish answer is, what happens after we die? I don't think anything. I don't think we believe in hell. I don't think we believe in heaven. I don't think we believe in anything, any reincarnation. I don't think. And then most of us who are Jewish will sit with that and think, I don't think that's actually true. So you can find a lot of interesting corroboration for all kinds of wonderful ideas of what happens. There are rabbis in the Talmud who debated this idea that there was a hell. Gehenna is the word they used. Fascinatingly, really famous rabbi commentators talk about how you could only get there for 12 months, which makes it sound a little bit like what Father Gerry's telling us is purgatory. And that you only got sent there for, I think in one of the places it talks about 3 different things you could do wrong. Adultery, we can all agree on that. Embarrassing your fellow human in public, and using an obnoxious name for another person, which begs the question, murder? I mean, really? So that's interesting. So there's all kinds of writings you can find, but if you were to just go out man on the street interviews and ask most American Jews, what do you think happens in the afterlife? Most of us don't have a really formulated answer. There's not really a doctrine that we're taught in Sunday school that tells us what's going to happen. Our focus is really on repairing the world while we're living in it, on doing the work that we believe God has put us here to do. We're each created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and so we are supposed to act as God. We are not gods. We're supposed to remember that every day, but we're supposed to do the things in the world that God would like to do. And when our time is finished, our time is finished. That's not to say that we're gone, We know full well there are plenty of people who have died in our lives who we carry with us in our hearts every day. And whether we wear a piece of their jewelry or a sweater or a hat or just words come out of our mouths and we realize, oh, that's my grandmother, mother, aunt, whatever. We know we carry them with us, and we know people live on through the things they said, the things they did. Some people build beautiful structures and get their names on them. Some people train folks to do all kinds of jobs, and they live on in that way. So we know that there is an immortality, but it isn't necessarily one we can picture what it looks like. There are fascinating debates in the Talmud, again, in these ancient writings by the rabbis about what does it look like in heaven. Some said in the Talmud that the righteous will sit at golden banquet tables, which sort of fits with some of the pretty paintings we're imagining, back in Italy. One sage said, the central activities of life in the world to come will be celebrating Shabbat, the Sabbath, enjoying sunshine, and sexual intercourse. Okay, so there's some really particular interesting ideas, but there's nothing in our liturgy that tells us what happens, in heaven. What is this heaven idea? And when someone actually dies in our tradition, the day of the funeral is called a levaya. It's an accompanying of this person, and we imagine that we are accompanying their body, but we're also accompanying their soul. And every time we say our mourners' prayers, whether it is on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on the Sabbath, every year when we remember the date that person's passed, we imagine that we are helping to lift their soul higher and higher. Maybe not to the golden banquet room where they sit in the sunshine on Shabbat and do other things, but we are somehow elevating their memory, elevating their soul, and we imagine that their soul is living on. There is some idea of reincarnation. There's various sages who've written about it. Some dismiss it, some are really into it. The only lasting tradition, I think, in our modern American Jewish consciousness is that we often name our children. Ashkenazi, Eastern European derived Jews name our children after someone who's passed away, with the idea that you're sprinkling a little bit of their soul into this next generation, which is a lovely tradition. I don't know if any of you have experienced feeling like that person has come back in a child, but it can't hurt as long as you like the person. Yeah, that's sort of a sprinkle of the idea. I mean, one of the readings that I read, a more modern rabbi, Rabbi Milton Steinberg, said, death cannot be and is not the end of life. Man transcends death in many altogether naturalistic fashions. He may be immortal biologically, through his children, in thought, through survival of his memory, in influence, by virtue of the continuance of his personality as a force among those who come after him, and ideally through his identification with the timeless things of spirit. So we believe there is a life after death. We just don't know what it looks like. We don't know where it takes place. We don't know if we get to have lunch. The joy of Judaism is that each Jewish person can hold their own thoughts about what that means. Much like the conversation last week about who's God. The head of the seminary where I studied used to say, I don't believe in the God you don't believe in. The idea of a little old man in a chair, I don't believe in it either. And I think the idea of the afterlife, we can also agree to have our own perspectives. It doesn't give us the comfort that some people might like from religion. So there's something really comforting about that parental way of saying, this is what's going to happen, do the right thing, and this will happen. So if you're looking for that, we're not the right tribe. But if you're okay with wrestling and discussing and parsing out different ideas and probably evolving what you think as your life extends year after year, then it's actually a really beautiful way to look at life and death.
I would just like to add, if I can, that the idea of not having all the answers, but that was always a nice thing about the Catholic Church, is there was always an answer, And at one point, we were talking about heaven and hell, and I said, do you believe in a place where somebody, could go to hell for all of the life based on things they did here in this temporal time? And they said, well, yeah. They said, well, why? They said, well, it's good to know what can happen to you, Sort of like it was idea, like, at least you know where you're going or not going. But St. Paul, at one point when they were asking him, in the resurrection, what kind of body do we get and what will it be like? And what he says is, these are stupid questions. We don't know the answer to this yet. But he says, then we shall see, even as we are seen, we shall know face to face. We shall see God and become a part of him.
Nice.
Somebody had their hand up. Who's
There's a microphone right here in the center if you have a question and want to pop up.
The reason we need to use the microphones is that people are speaking.
So I have a question about the soul. And so everybody has the soul placed in them when they're born. So before birth, is there a place somewhere where their soul's waiting to fill a body? Or is the soul created only at birth? And Father, with regard to the Catholic view of hell, purgatory, and heaven, so there are a lot of young people, children, who may die very early before they had much chance to experience life, much chance to do good, or an opportunity to do evil things. And so, are they treated differently in the Catholic theology than mature adults who had a life to do both good and bad? So, I'd be interested in your view as to where the souls are that get placed in bodies. So, a soul presumably becomes eternal at birth. But were they there waiting to fill a body? Anyway.
Thanks, Cal. I mean, I personally love the somewhat Pixar idea of a room with all these giggling baby souls, discussing where they get to go, and probably doing mischief and taking dibs on families that could use a mischievous soul. But I don't think there's any clarity. I mean, it's really up to what you believe. There are some mystics who wrote about reincarnation and this idea that we're here to do something, and if we don't get it done and we die too soon, we're going to come back and we're going to, which is, to me, again, metaphorically a lesson of every time I have a challenge in my life, and it seems that something similar happens to me soon after, I realize the universe is shouting louder at me that I have not learned the lesson I was supposed to learn, and so now I get another opportunity to learn the lesson again. So that feels sort of similar, whether there actually are souls that are somewhere up there with the golden thrones getting ready to come on down and try again. I can't point you to a writing, although if I had time to do some reading, I probably could find you something, but I don't have a particular perspective. I don't know if there is a Catholic feeling of where those souls are hanging out.
I guess we came close to it in terms, because you're talking about if they didn't have any chance to do anything, enough good or enough bad. But the Catholic answer to that would be we don't gain our own salvation. It's always a gracious gift. We are responsible for what we've done in the body, for good or ill, because we all stand before the judgment throne of God. But God's also merciful. And so there's always been this question of, is there a hell, but is there anybody really in it? Because we realize that we cannot really speak for God completely or knowingly. God's thoughts are not our thoughts, his ways are not our ways. And left to ourselves, we are really in the idea of punishment and justice, and so some people deserve to go to hell, but we don't know that it's necessarily, if God's will is that none should be lost and that he is not a God of death but a God of life, then there must be some way for the omnipotent God to work all this out, and we just don't know yet. Hadn't heard the thing about the souls waiting. I like the Pixar thing. In our family, we were told that, at least my father was told, when he was little, where'd I come from? And it says, well, you were hanging on a hook up in heaven until it was time for you to be born, and then you fell off the hook, and all of a sudden, Grandma Bowen came out of the room with you in her arms. So you still have that little bit of an idea of and now maybe it might be similar to the stork bringing a baby and dropping it down your chimney. But the one thing with regard to that we came close to, what about people that hadn't done anything bad, but they died, this came up principally without baptism, and so what happened to them? And so the church temporarily came up with an idea of limbo, which was, it was a place of perfect happiness, but no punishment, but God was not there. And again, it's a tautology. How can you have a place of perfect happiness in the absence of God? So it was a question that came up and was never really well answered. I think today we simply say, for instance, when, God forbid, people lose children or before they're born, and in the liturgy that we have, the prayers that we have, it always they almost are described as angels, although theologically that's not accurate. An angel is an entirely pure spirit, but that's the conception that people have for children that die early. The idea is that there is a place up in heaven for them. Was that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
This is as much a comment as a question. I was a hospice social worker for St. Agnes Hospital, and one of the things I observed was not everybody, and that it's a generalization, but my sense is Catholics and perhaps all Christians who believe in life after death and a much more well-formed concept of heaven have an easier time at death. I always like to say that Jews do death well. We don't do dying very well. And it seems to me that concept of a well-formed concept of heaven and life after death versus our lack of one, I as a Jew, lack of one, seems to make the dying process more difficult. I wonder how to respond to that.
That's a really good point. I think that the Jewish religion has wonderful death rituals for the mourners. We understand that you cannot ignore the pain that you feel when someone you love dies, and we insist that you walk through it as opposed to ignoring it and distracting yourself. You're supposed to take time off from work. You're supposed to sit Shiva. Shiva's 7 days. Modern Jews often shorten that for a few days, but the ritual of forcing you to take time away from work. Some people cover their mirrors and don't look at themselves and don't worry about their appearance. You bring people to your home. You don't treat them like guests. They take care of you. They bring you food. Like that whole way of moving through grief is so beautiful, and science and psychologists have all come out and said, yeah, that's exactly what you should do. But you're right, the moment of realizing you are dying as a Jewish person who's not sure what's coming next is very challenging. I think that's something that we have to wrestle with, and we have to find how we want our religious teachings to help us through that. There's a wonderful scholar who actually is coming to our community in November for our Board of Rabbis Day of Learning, Simcha Raphael, who wrote one of those nice thick books I would have shared with you about dying and the afterlife. And he talks about how a lot of young Jews will turn to the Buddhist books on the Tibetan book on dying, and there's all these wonderful pieces of grief work in other religions, but they don't really have a piece of their own liturgy to hold on to. And I think you just named a challenge. I know when I've done chaplaincy work, if I walked into a Christian patient's room, we could have a much easier conversation about God and all that stuff, because they're just used to talking about it in a way that modern progressive Jews maybe aren't, and it's something we should work on, because we can learn a lot from each other on how to bear those burdens and lean on our traditions for that. Yeah. You have anything else to add?
Well, the only thing I thought of is how important, one of the nice things about practice of our faith is our Catholic imagination. It's poetic, it's Irish, it comes up with everything, and while it might not be the definitive answer, you're left with like, well, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe, you know. And so you can sort of gear towards where you want to hang your hat, because there's a wideness in the way to envision God's mercy, you know. And so we always going to say that we don't need to be limited. We don't need to be limited. But we have had to move from, in our liturgy, we did not have, remember when I talked about the black vestments and, you know, praying? In fact, when my great uncle was saying the prayers for his sister when Grandma Bowen died, he was using the old ritual, and it had again and again and again, requite her not, O God, according to her numberless sins, and do not let her, the author of all evil and death have you know, mastery over her. Instead, remember, you know, and my Aunt Fran, her daughter, finally said, Uncle Joe, stop it. Grandma didn't have those sins, you know. So there had to be a progression between what the church was saying at the point of death, especially liturgically, and what were the people needing. And so we began to then experience where we gave people the opportunity, for instance, to remember, to grieve, to acknowledge the particular holiness and goodness of this individual life, rather than just every time they got together, you say, fine, they're all in heaven now. Or they're in purgatory, we're praying for them. So it was the same way of trying to deal with one of the most important parts of life is the acceptance of death and the acceptance of the death of loved ones. And so the church's liturgy had to move in a whole different direction because of that. And I'm very grateful for it, too.
One of the wonderments for me is being able to use both of these traditions, coming from, as a Christian, coming from a Jewish perspective with Jesus. I choose to journey in the struggle, in the questioning, but it always answers for me in the definition of what faith is. There's a comfort in knowing that there is something really positive at the end, because to me, this world by itself makes zero sense. It's got to be something else. I don't know what it is either. My family is journeying through a grieving process right now. We lost our middle daughter in March, and I spoke to a friend of mine who was talking about her struggle with the concept of purgatory, as Gerry talked before. And I said, it doesn't make any sense to me, because we had just completed Easter, and what we believe as Christians is that Jesus died on the cross to save us. He died for us for all the sins that we had committed in our past, and for all the sins we were going to commit in the future. So what I have chosen to believe for my daughter is that she had that opportunity at that last instant, the next second after her death, to see the face of God, this beatific vision, as we call it, and him saying to her, talking about her life, and her looking at him and saying, I'm sorry. And he said, I love you, come home. That's cool for me. That's comforting for me, rather than, I don't have any idea where she is.
Right.
You know?
Right. Oh, John, thank you. Yeah, I mean, when you say the word story, some people think stories are things we read to children and they're not true, but story is everything. Our traditions are stories, and so the stories we tell ourselves are very important, and they are what bring meaning to everything. And like John said, this world doesn't make any sense, so we have to tell a story and make sense of it. And our traditions tell us that the people we love are somehow with us. And whether it's a wink from the universe and, you know, a song John's daughter loves comes on the radio, or whether it's a feeling that comes over us and suddenly we're in the presence of our grandparent, they're definitely there somehow. I mean, Gerry and I can tell you what the liturgy and the rabbis and priests have said, but we know our own experience, and we know that we're made of stardust, we are made of love, and that can't go away, whether someone's in a box or cremated or sprinkled somewhere. They're still with us. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the beautiful and hot
it being hard that our tradition doesn't have something, but I was also thinking, and so I want to add to your thoughts and have you stick a little bit more because I know you can. One of the things that we do in Jewish tradition before somebody dies is, much like there is in Catholic tradition, there's a confessional. Ours is called the final confessional, and in fact, we relive that on Yom Kippur every year of our lives until the final time before we die. And part of that final confession was with the Yajor, the last verse of the Torah. I lift your hands, I trust my spirit when I sleep and when I wake. And I have faith that you will hold me and comfort me. And I wonder how that plays into your idea of we don't have a direction, because it would seem to me that when we say those words, as somebody is dying, that we're saying whatever there's going to be, God is going to take care of you and it's going to be some comfort. Maybe we don't do enough talking about that.
Yeah.
But it's certainly there. So I was just wondering that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Rabbi Joseph alluded to the vidui, the confession that we say at the end of life, and I think this is another one of those tricky things in America. We have progressive Jews being progressive Jews, and we live in a Christian society. The majority religion is Christian. So if you watch any popular television movies and you're Jewish, you know what the Christians do. And so we all know if someone's Catholic and they're dying, they're going to call a priest, and there's going to be some sort of prayer that's said before they die. In fact, when I would walk into a hospital room or hospice room as a chaplain, even though I was Jewish, people would brace themselves because they thought I was like the priest coming to say the last prayer, and then clearly they're dying and their doctor hasn't told them that that's what's happening. We have this ritual in Judaism. Nobody seems to know about it until someone in your family is dying, and then a rabbi or a cantor comes in and helps you with this prayer. Or you make the connection because someone leads a Yom Kippur service and explains that this is what we're doing. On Yom Kippur, on our Day of Atonement, once a year, we reenact our own death. Many people will come to services in their kittel, in their white robe that is the garment they'll be buried in eventually. Some of us wear something white to mimic that. We choose not to wear any leather or animal products. Not everyone. Some people do this. We don't eat all day. We abstain from all the worldly pleasures. We imagine we are already like angels. And we say these prayers. And so we do have some rituals to help us. We have really bad marketing. And then this beautiful end of the Adon Olam prayer that Rabbi Joseph mentioned, this idea that God will hold us. I mean, many of us sing that last paragraph like a lullaby. And there is that idea. We never want to teach children that death is like going to sleep. That's a bad thing that causes a hot mess for children's psychology. But we do have that little flavor of it, that it's, you're going to be held in the same way that your parent held you when you fell asleep as a child or when you were upset as a child. And that is part of our tradition. So we probably need to talk about it more and explain it more. And there's actually a movement in this country now of death doulas, people who help you go through death, and death cafes where people get together in a cafe and talk about death. How wild is that? But it's a problem. We don't talk about it. We have a society that's very focused on everyone should be young and beautiful and glamorous, and can we not talk about death? And so when we don't, then it becomes this mystery. And the more we talk about it, it's less mysterious. And maybe that's part of it, is when everyone knows what the ritual is, it's not as scary, and you are more comfortable walking in. And if we leave it all too mysterious, then it's hard for us to walk forward. Yeah.
When you were mentioning how people see you as a chaplain, and then if you walk into the room, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm dying. I've had that happen with the priest, because the tradition is you call the priest when someone's dying. And so I've actually had people that would say, Father, please come up, Mom's dying, she's at the hospital. Okay, but can you come and give her the last rites? Which is really, we now call it the sacrament of anointing, or the sacrament of the sick. You don't have to be dying to receive it, but you also can receive it as you were dying. Ideally, it's really meant for people to be conscious, and they can hear the prayers, they can feel the support. So, but the old idea of it was, this is what you did when you were on your way out, the priest came in. And so it would say, don't let Mom know you're here to anoint her, because she doesn't know she's dying. and we don't want to scare her. So I was a much younger man then. So what I said is, okay, how about this? I'll take off my collar. I'll dress like one of the orderlies. I'll come in with a broom. I'll have the oil on my finger, and I'll stumble towards her bed. I never said that again to anybody after that. But the reason why I share it with you is the person said, could you do that? And what happened is I said, does your mom believe? He says, oh yeah, she was in church every day. She'd go to 3 masses on a Sunday if she could. And says, well, your mother is not going to be afraid when I walk in. And I walked in and she said, but I had to say, trust me on this. And when she saw me walk in, she says, Father, I've been expecting you. Now, that leads me to something that I always admire in the evangelical Protestant church. Because as Catholics, you always had an answer. And so one was, you should never say, I can't go to heaven. That's despair. That's a sin. But you should never presume you're going to heaven. That's presumption. That's also a sin. So you're always on a knife edge. But I love the part of where people, often in a Protestant, more biblical-centered faith, when the time comes, they'll say something like, I'm not afraid. I know my Jesus is going to embrace me and take me to his glory. And for us, we don't feel completely comfortable in that, but I've always admired how wonderful it must be to have that kind of calm assurance.
So I want to thank everyone for this particular session, as so many of my friends and allies are getting older and certainly thinking about this. I heard something that was comforting to me, and to me, comforting is looking up at heaven and thinking, I know my mom's up there and my dad and my loved ones, and so not having that is tricky and difficult. But I heard someone had read something in Judaic literature. I don't know if it was from the Talmud, maybe not, because I haven't heard this prior to this recollection of this story, and it relates to the soul. And of course, I think no one can visualize a soul, so that's already an amorphous thing. But what it said was that the soul exists as long as there is still on this earth a memory of the person who passed away. And the more you tell your children, and they tell their children, and they tell their children, and you talk to your neighbors about people that you really want to still be alive, that you love, the more that soul is alive, and it continues through generations and generations, through storytelling and recounting the names and the lives of these people. And I, who loves stories and loves to tell the same one over and over and over again, just found that to be very comforting. I'm just wondering if that's something that was just a contemporary thing that's cropped up, or whether either of you have heard about that as a tenet of religion.
Well, it reminds me of the scripture where Jesus is talking about, could a mother ever forget her child? Even if that were so, I will never forget you. And so the idea is we argue from the lesser to the greater. If we, with all our imperfection and sins, know how to love each other forever and unconditionally, then how much more is that possible for the God of heaven and earth and of all creation and all souls? So I think if at one time Jesus told me, if you with all your sinfulness know how to give your children good things, how much more will the Father in heaven?
It's beautiful. Yeah, I don't know where that comes from, Darla, but I like it very much, and it's consistent with my thinking. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you all for making this presentation possible. I just would like to give a shout out to Rabbi Joseph, who has taught us courses in the past that I think helped me deal with the unknowns of life. And one of those is, it's not a new concept, the concept of the living will. I'm very much attached to a lot of the things that were handed down to me from my parents or my grandparents. And I know, like a lot of my friends were saying, our kids don't want our things. it's because we don't want to be forgotten. I mean, it's not the physical thing we care about, it's that we don't want to be forgotten. So I have taken the rabbi's topics, and every once in a while when I can't sleep, which is getting to be more and more, I'll say, why are these candlesticks important to me? Why are and then talk about it, and that's what I want to give my children, and that's how I feel that my soul will live on. So thank you, Rabbi.
That's beautiful, Judy, and it gets to what Darla was saying about stories. Because if your children inherit the candlesticks and they don't know anything about them, they're nice, and they might look at them and think of mom and grandma, but to have a story is a fantastic thing, and for all of us to sit and write those things down somehow would be such a wonderful legacy. And sometimes you don't have a story, but like I have a string of my grandmother's pearls, and every time I think my Nana should be with me for something, I wear them. I wore them when Father Gerry and I did a funeral for a friend a few weeks ago, because I just felt like my Nana was the first person in my life who said it doesn't matter what someone else believes. If they believe in love, then they can be part of our family. And there we were at this funeral of this beautiful, beautiful woman who was Catholic, and her husband who was Jewish, and her kids who were Jewish, and my friend and I were doing it together, and I was like, oh yeah, Nana'd be here if she could be here, and I put them on without thinking. So I think, yeah, the things can have memories and carry stories, and that's such a lovely idea, rather than thinking you're just leaving them with stuff.
I have a question I wanted to ask, because it's about life and death. Have you ever had any experiences, spiritual experiences, or almost a mystical experience of feeling somebody who had passed? You've alluded to this with regard to the pearls, but that someone was just letting you know they were okay, or something like that. Any contact?
So I share an experience with my mom, who might be on the interwebs somewhere. Hi, Mom. When her brother passed away, it was at the same time of year that the planet Mars was visible in the sky. And he has a grave, and it's in Minnesota. Neither my mom nor I live in Minnesota. But somehow I've associated seeing Mars with seeing my uncle. And it's like he's checking in. He's looking to see how we're doing. He's probably giddy that my son is engaged, and he's going to show up at that wedding. So I can tell you when Mars will show up next summer. I can pretty much guarantee it. But yeah, there are those little things that don't make a whole lot of sense. Sometimes they make a lot of sense, and it's that you're reading a passage and it rings a bell for me that I've heard someone say that before in my life. Yeah, I think that happens. I think it happens a lot. I think we don't necessarily talk about, like, you have the circle of your friends you can talk about that stuff with, and then you have the friends you cannot talk about that stuff with. Which is sort of a shame if you live that life. I know I do. But it definitely happens. Does it happen to you?
Oh, yes, I'm affirm. One of the things that is part of my calm assurance that there's something after death is the fact that I have been touched by people who have passed on, but have made their presence felt and known in ways that are not just clearly imagination. And so the difference between ourselves here and the kingdom of heaven there's probably a lot thinner veil separating us than what we tend to think of. And some of the experiences that we've had just reinforce that. No need to really go into what the paranormal experiences are, you know. But one interesting thing is a woman came to me who was in our parish, and she says, Father, she says, I've been praying, and I can't give you all the background to her, but that's not necessary. But she said, somebody told me to come here and see you and tell you, because they said you're going through a very difficult time right now. And she wants me to come and tell you this, that everything is going to be okay. And said she was a sister, and she was you were very important to her. Or she was very important to me, or both. And I thought, I'm thinking sister or religious, you know. But in terms of finally figuring out what was going on, it was most likely my father's sister, you know, who was very important to us. She was the one who always gathered the family Anytime anything was happening at her house, whether it was Christmas or Easter or a 4th of July or a birthday or an anniversary or a baby shower, she was the hostess with the mostest, and was so intently engaged with family. She always wished nothing but the best for you. So it took me a while to figure it out. I have to tell you, at first when the person came to me and said, I'm thinking like, oh, yeah, right, sure, you know. And another story of somebody, you know, is having an experience. Because whether you know it or not, a lot of people come up to us and say, Father, could you bless me? I think I'm possessed by a demon. I'm not making this up.
Wow.
In which case I will say, okay, let me assure you first of all that you're not possessed. She says, how do you know that? I said, if you were really possessed by a demon, do you think the devil would let you come and talk to a priest? But as we get older, I find these experiences, which we don't talk about, are real in other people's lives as well. And so I can't deny the reality of that it's not simply wish fulfillment or magical thinking. You know, there is something that's going on, you know, that there's a connection. One of my friends just died recently, and everybody wants a sign, you know. So he's been sending little hearts to his wife. If she picks up a glass of water, what's left instead of a ring, it's a heart. It's all sorts of things. But one of the things he said to her the day after he died, or the evening after he died, is he said, you have no idea how connected everything is. And so she's clung to that, held on to that. So I just mention this because we didn't get into the theology of this, but that tends to be one of the, I want to say somatic experiences, one of the personal experiences that we tend to have, which speaks to us of things beyond our sight.
Beautiful. Anybody else?
I get to ask more questions.
Okay.
No one else is getting up.
So we've spoken about heaven, hell, Gehenna, limbo. We've spoken about resurrection. What we've not spoken about as we think about life after death is the belief in two things, ghosts, which I know there are ghost stories in Judaism, and also spirits that take over other people, dibuks. And so can you talk a little bit about, Judaism has a very wide range of beliefs because basically we can believe anything, and that does appear in our folk tales and is sometimes spoken. So do you want to sort of address some of that, the spooky stuff, which is always great for, you know, a spooky evening around the campfire? And I'm wondering if there is similar beliefs in Catholicism or in Christianity in general.
What was your question?
About ghosts and spirits and spooky possession by, you know.
Oh, you're asking about ghosts and spirits and spooky possessions? Oh, that's interesting. Well, I mean, if you'd have to say, ask me, interesting thing is, before we talked about, you know, the Holy Spirit, we spoke about the Holy Ghost, you know, in our Catholic iconography. The, if you ask me a question, say, do I believe in ghosts? I would say certainly yes. But it isn't like the Casper variety, you know. It somehow is a continuation, an inbreaking here in our world of someone else who is actually on another, in the life of the world to come. In our Catholic tradition, we have a very strong tradition of the communion of the saints, which is that, you know, they care about us. They still wish our good. They pray for us. And we even have this thing of intercession. They intercede for us, which is a problem for many faiths because it appears to be, you know, taking away something from God. Why does God need any help in helping us? But it more is an idea of all hands on deck. And it can be mysterious. Like, for instance, St. Anthony, we used to have a thing, St. Anthony, please come around. Something's lost that must be found. Do you know St. Anthony was in charge of finding lost articles? I didn't know that. And I mean, well, I've known that for long, but I don't know how he got that job, to tell you the truth. Except it seems to work. Did you know if you take a little statue of St. Joseph and you bury him upside down in front of your house will sell?
Yes, I have friends who borrow their Catholic friends' statues. Yes.
I can tell you, my mother, in the middle of winter after her mother died, they had to try to sell the house. And my father said, it'll never sell, never sell. We should just give it away. And my mother didn't have a statue of St. Joseph, but she had a holy card of St. Joseph. She couldn't dig in the ground to put in, but when she went to her mother's house, she lifted up a brick from the garden, put the picture underneath the brick, and said, I hope this is good enough.
Did it work?
And the house sold the next day. So, faith is a substance of things to be hoped for, and we cannot completely imagine. All of our religious talk is a way of trying to describe what we hope for and believe in and trust in. And to that extent, I believe that everybody can't be wrong in some of the way they image the heaven and they image the connections we have with one another. And so if I even see somebody who goes to his wife's grave with a can of pledge and he's polishing the stone and he pulls out a lawn chair from his trunk and sits there and talks to her, that's a connection. And it's not only in that person's mind. I believe there's a real conversation going on. Like when you talk about your Nana's pearls. Was that a help? I mean, to say, what about ghosts and spooky things, you can simply say it can be unexplained paraphenomena if you want, or, super normal things, but there's something there. There's still something there. And because many stories have always articulated it, the story is a way of trying to explain what was somebody's common experience. What does this mean? And that's a way to put some kind of name to it. But fortunately, they've always been benign. I haven't had anybody come to me and say, I don't mean to monopolize the time, but this is one where people would always say, like, I had a near-death experience and I could see, go to the light. I could see people, cheering me on, and I had great sense of peacefulness, And I always said, well, that's great. I said, however, I think, how can we never see anybody who says, I had a near-death experience. It was awful. There were flames, there were pigs, pitchforks, there was people stabbing me with knives, I would think that if...
Yeah, you've heard enough of these. Somebody should have said that.
Someone should have said that, or else God is far more merciful than we can possibly imagine.
I like that interpretation. Yeah. There are lots of folk tales and things about ghosts and dibooks and all that stuff. And I have to admit, I'm not deep into it, so I'm absolutely the wrong person to talk about it. But I did have a grandmother who was really into angels. And as a young person, I thought angels were a Christian concept. I never heard anyone in my synagogue talk about angels. And then as an adult, I dove into all the Hasidic literature and all the mystical literature and realized, behold, we started the angel thing. The Jews have angels. There's a beautiful lullaby where you sing that the angels will surround you to children, and I sing it to myself. And so we have all of these beautiful little stories. We don't talk about them all the time. I think it's time to share some of those. And while you're sharing the candlesticks and the pearls with the little ones, maybe you could share some of the angel stories and the angel songs and let people know that that's not an exclusive set of beliefs and stories, but it's actually available to all of us. It's in all of our traditions.
I read that more people are choosing to be cremated after death. What is your thoughts on that? Do we need to keep our bodies?
It's an interesting question. A lot of American Jews are really uncomfortable with cremation because of one thing, the Holocaust. And the mention of a body in an oven is just such a trigger that it is not a question to discuss. It is not debatable. And many people of a generation older than me will not go there. No. And there's a lot of people in this country who have decided there's not a lot of space anymore, or it's more expensive to do a casket burial, and they want to be cremated. And that story of the connection to the Holocaust doesn't bother them at all. We can find liturgical sources to back up everything. That's the joy of our tradition. So does it bother me? When I was in seminary, our life cycle teacher, the amazing Rabbi Marcia Prager, said, you have to watch a video. You have to know what this is, so that when you talk to your congregants, you understand what you're talking about. I wouldn't send you that video. It's hard to think about, but pine box under the ground and the worms are crawling around, that's kind of hard to think about too. So I think that all of these ideas of what happens to our physical body, if we think about them for too long, we're going to upset our delicate balance. I think that everyone has their own right decision. Sometimes it makes sense to do cremation either because of environmental thoughts or expense, or because you don't have a place. You know, it used to be our communities, we all lived in the same place. And you could go visit the graves of your relatives on a regular basis. And now you live a plane ride away from someone. Does it make sense to have them in that place? I don't know. And I think a lot of people are choosing that's their reason, and they want the remains of their beloved to be portable, to go with them wherever they move. I don't have an issue with that. I think it's the kind of thing that nobody talks about and thinks about, so we should talk about it and think about it. But there isn't necessarily one answer pointing people. Yeah.
Just to simply say we had the same thing with cremation is becoming very, very prevalent. And we have no problem with it. At one time there was a concern about, did it show like a respect for the body? But it's not where people are with it. And so you can have that in the church without any problem. Whatever helps, helps.
Here we go. So a big thank you to Father Gerry and to Hazzan Weishaar. They did an amazing job. The topics you've chosen are incredible as a group, and it's also very hard as clergy just to speak about it for 10 minutes. For those of you that are part of the Jewish community, our Jewish Day of Learning this year, which I believe is November 22nd, 20th, thank you, is going to be from 2 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. here, and it's going to be all on a difficult mitzvah, looking at the death cycle and what all the issues that are involved in it. So I hope you will join all the rabbis in the community for that. And of course, if you're more interested, talk to your pastors, talk to your priests. If you're in the Christian tradition, there'll be more. Next week, I believe I am speaking with Pastor Phil, who was here, just left. And so I hope that you will come back and join us. The YouTube should be up by tomorrow, so tell your friends, or you can see it on streaming, on the OMI streaming. Thanks for coming.
This is such a great idea.
Yeah.
I said, this is such a great idea. Yeah.
It's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
I had a couple other jokes.
I'm sure you did.
It says, if a kid asks where rain comes from, I think a cute thing to tell him is God is crying. And if they ask why God is crying, another cute thing to tell him is probably because of something you did. And here's the last one was, I just read a list of the 100 things to do before you die. I was surprised that yell for help wasn't one of them. And it says, I believe you should live each day as if it were your last, which is why I don't have any clean laundry, because come on, who wants to wash clothes in the last day of their life? Wonderful.
Yeah, there we go.
Well, you know what? There has to be some stories, not only the stories of like our faith, but the stories of loony things that happen with it.
Yeah, yeah. It's good. It's nice.
He was also really nice. Two horses.
Oh, I have a name tag at home. You know what? I ordered a name tag the first week of March of 2020 from Wonderful Magnetics that says my name and Nefesh, and it arrived because y'all shut down. I was like, well, okay. Let's have a door. Okay, great. You're not capturing anything. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you said this is bigger than last week. It's great. Yeah. 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 It's not bad. I was like, man, that is one thing I just did not go down the rabbit hole or the rabbi hole at all. You remember a ghost story? Yeah, no. It's hilarious. Can't believe people come into your office and say they think they're
There's
possessed.
a quiet everybody got when I said that.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to think, oh, I know somebody who's possessed.
Yeah, no.
And again, it's part of its culture. And it's a lot, it's very prevalent among Spanish and Africa. More so than with the Polish, but Polish and Irish is very accurate among them. Nobody ever thought it was possessed. We have to be just being real.
Yeah, oh yeah. Sarah. Yeah, that's true, okay. Huh. Fascinating.
Thank you so much. Yes. I must say that I really found myself, one thing I wanted to do at some point was just do a PowerPoint with some of the imagery, the iconography that we have. And it might be interesting, but I realized I couldn't do that in 10 minutes. And
Brandon was just here and he took a look at everything and we got rid of 2 cables, but it seems like either this microphone or this cable cut.
Yeah, I got a text from my mom. Question, can't hear her. Oh, good.
You know, it made a difference that
Yeah, I think this cable's bad right here.
So I'm going in with Rabbi to show her. I think the door is open.
It is. Well, no, I just locked it.
is to at some point have an opportunity to showcase religious art.
And I think our gallery was showing us all the different faces and explaining the religious part that I didn't necessarily know, and also the ridiculous, like the one of the demon over the door. She explained the Pope secretary because it was famous one, so he put his face
on it, yeah.
Okay, so sadly and interestingly, while we were talking,
Oh my goodness.
96.
Probably couldn't take the new clothes.
That's true.
Did she get to anoint the person before she died?
She did that like 2 months ago. Oh my God. Which we all know about because we watched The Crown and have seen how that works.
Gee, she missed a great opportunity. She could have done it just before she said, and now I.
Yeah, that would really make someone feel like they're in the wrong spot.
Right on, like, I'm not talking to you anymore.